p.m. Eastern. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for today's webinar, Redefining Success in K-12 Education, getting started with a profile of a graduate conversation in your schools and communities. If you have questions today, we are welcoming questions throughout the webinar. My name is Susan Patrick. I'm the President and CEO of iNACOL, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar as well offering an introduction to help set the context. Joining me today is Ken Kay. I've known Ken for many years when he founded the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. I know many of you are familiar with that initiative back in 2002, and he has been leading efforts in really rethinking how we might redefine education for student success over decades. Today, Ken is the CEO of ESSA 21, which is a professional learning community for education leaders committed to 21st century education. I am so pleased that Ken will be joining us today, and I'm a huge fan of his work and the work that he's doing now with the Profile of a Graduate initiative. So please, throughout the webinar, use the chat box, which you'll see in the lower left-hand corner of the webinar screen, to type in any questions that you have. I'll be jumping in and interrupting at various times to raise up those questions so that we may address them throughout. If you're on a phone, please feel free to mute your phone so we have a clear connection. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's webinar. This idea of rethinking education and redefining student success in K-12 education is not just happening across the United States, but is a global conversation. And the Director General of UNESCO, in the foreword to this powerful book on rethinking education, calls out, what education do we need for the 21st century, and what is the purpose of education in this current context of societal transformation? She goes on to share how ministries of education and education systems around the globe are questioning what are the goals of education. As the world is changing, quote, education must also change. Societies everywhere are undergoing a deep transformation, and it calls for new forms of education to foster the competencies that societies and economies need today and tomorrow. Wrapping up, there is an expression that, quote, across the world we have seen great progress in expanding learning opportunities for all, yet we must draw the right lessons to chart a new course forward. Access is not enough. We need a new focus on the quality of education, the relevance of learning, and on what children, youth, and adults are actually learning. We need an ever stronger focus on teachers and educators and communities as change agents across the board. And to wrap up, she states, this is why we must think big again and revision education in a changing world. For this, we need debate and dialogue across the board to be both aspirational and inspirational. And I think leading into this webinar, this is really critical to think about. This is happening around the world. This conversation around redefining student success is happening in the leading education systems globally. And if you look at these key trends and drivers, you see on the far left, stakeholders are being brought together to articulate principles around the goals for their education system. This is at the core of today's webinar for Profile of a Graduate, to guide policy. They are rethinking how we might recognize learning that takes place inside and outside of the classroom. There are broader networks of learning spaces, again, inside and outside of schools. And it's focused on transformation, focused on inclusion and equity for all students, and seeing education as a great equalizer for students' future success. So today's webinar is focused on redefining student success and the profile of a graduate. we're going to take a quick look at the opportunities in the U.S. under the federal Every Student Succeeds Act. So, as we know, the ESSA or ESSA was passed in December 2015, and it specifically asks communities, states, educators, parents, and families to think about a more holistic definition of student success. It also specifically asks for policy in K-12 education to move from compliance to continuous improvement to get students what they need. At the heart of this is asking, what do students need to know and be able to do on graduation? Literacy and numeracy are essential, but no longer sufficient. So there is a call to action right now to think differently about the goals and purpose of our K-12 education system. And in ESSA or ESSA, at the heart, you must start with redefining student success through conversations with your communities to help articulate those goals. Then and only then will communities provide that information, work with their state departments of ed for what does it mean to rethink accountability with multiple metrics for continuous improvement? What does that mean for thinking differently about systems, plural, of assessments? And what does that mean when we think about our next generation educator and leader workforce? How do we build capacity in that lead forward in our workforce and help educators lead this charge to the future of education and the change? So at the heart of the future of education is redefining student success, the opportunity for stakeholders to drive this conversation. Many communities felt frozen out under No Child Left Behind. The goals were set, the targets were set. Now stakeholders and communities are coming back together, and even though this year state plans for ESSA are being turned into the U.S. Department of Ed, there is a clear provision in the law for amendments to state plans to focus on continuous improvement. So states can resubmit state plans to help move, and this profile of a graduate work is absolutely essential to meaningful drive system conversations around what we want the profile of a graduate to be. So two quick examples to lead off this introduction, and one is the work in Virginia on profile of a graduate. This came from you would say the ground up, from communities and school districts leading the conversation around what they wanted a more holistic profile of a graduate to look like, going to their State Department of Ed and their state board, who sat into state policy. In Virginia, this came from across the state and communities, and it is indeed focused on content knowledge, but also on workplace skills, community engagement, civic responsibility, as well as career exploration. And this visual gives you an idea of the more holistic set of skills, knowledge, and competencies that are outlined in the Virginia profile of a graduate regulations. So again, I'm not going to read through all the text of the slides, but you can see in Virginia they're moving towards a more holistic definition of what it means to graduate, what the high school diploma will look like and offer. Again, second example, before I wrap up and turn this over to Ken, is the South Carolina profile of a graduate work. Again, I focused on world-class knowledge, but also the skills, creativity, innovation, life, and career characteristics and dispositions needed across the state. So we're seeing this move towards transformation to focus on broader outcomes for students. And at the local level, these are deep community conversations. The last example I'll give is at a local level in Lindsay, California. The superintendent, Tom Rooney, says, you know, the superintendent's job really changes to become about fulfilling the will of the community. So they've identified the knowledge, the skills, the characteristics that they want their graduates to have, their profile of a graduate upon graduation. Every student in Lindsay, California has a personalized learning plan, and the community, teachers, students, families, workforce, are all involved in the strategic design of this profile of the graduate and the ongoing monitoring. So it's really about having a reciprocal relationship with your community, families, students, and as well as aligning that state policy. So with that wraps up my overview and introduction into this topic of profile of a graduate. And you might be asking, well, how do you do this? And I will turn it over to Ken Kay from EdLeader 21 to talk about their work in helping to lead and catalyze these conversations across the U.S. Ken? Hi, Ken, I can't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute. Hi, Ken. Can you hear me?
For inviting me, and
Hi,
thank the iNACOL for their great leadership.
Thank you.
So I think Susan has set up the topic as well as it can be set up. And so I'm going to launch into my presentation and start with the first question, which is, why do we need a profile of a graduate? And given Susan's presentation, I'll do this fairly briefly, but I want you to see some of the tools I use in helping communities understand the need. So this first picture is a picture of the factories in 1950s, and one of the points I like to make is that our educational system at the time wasn't tremendously broken. In fact, it was doing a great job of producing people who would work in these contexts. These were highly hierarchical systems where people were doing the same thing over and over again, and they needed the system that we had actually did a good job of instilling work ethic, of instilling discipline, of instilling loyalty, and so I think our educational system was well designed for that time. But if you move now to the next slide, which is the Google offices, these are very different organizations, and what the real point here is that the educational system that really propelled people towards factory-like jobs, that propelled people toward 30 to 40-year careers in one discipline or one entity are really different, doesn't apply as well to the world of today, either to the non-hierarchical organizations like Google or to a life in which an individual is going to have 10 to 15 jobs and 3 to 5 careers. So the slide that talks about both these, this is the transition we're under. How is it that our educational system can transition from a world that did a great job of preparing us for 20th century work? What do we have to do with the educational system so that it is preparing people for the 21st century work? The quote from Google speaks for itself, but I want to ask each of you whether you know the answer to this question, which is, Google has done a lot of analysis in its workforce about what requirements that it has for employment and how they relate to success at Google. And so they asked the question, what is the relationship between the existence of a high school degree and the existence of a college degree and success at Google? And the answer is, there is none. There is no correlation between an employee having a high school or college degree and their success at Google. And so that really raises the question of, how do companies like Google find people that work in 21st century organizations? So I wanted to show you this chart. This is a survey that was done of the top 300 HR officers in the top 300 global companies. This was done in 2015 and released last year. And they were asked the simple question, what are the skill sets that employees of your company need to be successful? What the current employees, what competencies do they need to have, and as you hire, what competencies are you looking for? So I want to ask all of you to reflect for a moment. Take a look at this list, 1 through 10, and ask yourselves, how does my current school or district do in preparing young people with these 10 competencies? So I just want you to look at the list and reflect on that for a moment. Okay, so when I ask people that question, they often say, there are some things that we're doing well. Many districts think that they're doing well on items 1 and 2, complex problem solving and critical thinking. Some districts are focused on emotional intelligence. And then when I ask them where are the areas that they're currently not focused or not focused comprehensively, they'll say, well, there's some creativity, but only in pockets. We don't focus much on people management skills. Some people say we don't focus much on emotional intelligence, although some districts do. We don't focus much on a service orientation. And I think some districts are mixed on cognitive flexibility. Some say they are focused on them and some not. So I bring all of that to your attention because this slide, in my mind, talks about the delta between where we are today and where we need to be in 2020. And I know that it's not every district job to prepare people for jobs at the 300 largest global companies, but you do want your best students, or you do want any student who aspires to that job to be able to do it. And so addressing this delta is important. And this next slide is one that I've become very identified with going around the country showing to people. And it really captures in one simple place the transformation as we see it, which is, and these are the questions I usually ask. How many of you identify that you went to K through 12 under the student A model? And of course, most people raise their hands. And then the question is, if you were an employer choosing between student A and student B and you had to decide who would you hire, most people tell me they would hire student B. I must say, I did have one guy in Phoenix one time say to me, well, actually, I'd prefer student A. And I said, oh, tell me what that's about. And they said, I have something I want them to do, and I really don't want them to ask me a lot of questions. But the second question, the next question is, if you were going to cultivate citizenship, responsible 21st century citizens, who would make the better citizen, student A or student B? And then finally, which of these students would do better in their personal challenges, family challenges, health challenges, financial challenges? So those are all softball questions. The real hard question is, why is it that everybody wants student B and we're still stuck in the student A model? And you know, we can go through all those reasons. Our parents went to school as student A. Our teachers went to school under the student A model. Our school board members went to school under the student A model. But nonetheless, we know we need to migrate to student B. There are lots of state policy. As Susan has said, most state policy is focused on student A. Most state assessments are focused on student A. So we have a rough row to hoe, But the goal, if I had to, when people say, well, what is Ed Leader 21 as a PLC for leaders focused on? We are a PLC for leaders that are all dedicated towards taking their schools or districts and moving from the student A to the student B model. So let me just ask you, how many of you, we're not going to get a tally, but how many of you believe that you have created a version of student B? And how many of you think that you have schools or districts that have adopted a student B model, clearly? So the challenge we want to take on today in the remainder here is, how do you create a student B model? How do you have the kind of dialogue Susan alluded to with your community that gets you to a consensus on student B? And then what will the implications of the student B model be? What, if you adopt a student B model, what impact will it have on your district? And that's what we'll cover here. So the next section is to describe to you the profile of a graduate campaign that we launched in March. And you can access the materials that I'm going to be discussing by going to profileofagraduate.org. So this is a new site that we created in the spring, and these resources are all free, and they will help you think about the profile of a graduate and what you might do to move it along. So one of my favorite pieces in this new Profile of a Graduate site is called the Profile of a Graduate Builder. And it is really neat. I don't know whether you actually want to go onto this go and do a Profile of a Graduate Builder while we're on the webinar, because then you won't be listening to me. Certainly several of you have already gone to the site to look at it. But let me give you a homework assignment, which is sometime between now and Monday morning, I want you all to go onto the site and build your own profile of a graduate. And it has about 50 possibilities. You can add others. It does. Usually people come up with 4 to 6 competencies. But what's neat about this builder is that it will ask you to identify yourself as a student, as a teacher, as a parent, as an administrator, as a community member, as a business leader, as a board member. And then it will give you advice about what to do with the profile of a graduate that you have created. And I think that that's important, because if you're a student, you don't want to just fill it out. You want to show it to your teacher or show it to your principal and say, this was my idea for a profile of a graduate. Why don't we have one for our whole school? How do we get the school community involved? Or if you're a principal and think there ought to be a profile of a graduate for the whole district, take the profile of a graduate and bring it to your superintendent and say, shouldn't we have a profile of a graduate at the district level, which you clearly should. You don't want to have this happen school by school, because the resources you'll need to implement it probably reside at the district level. So you need a district approach to this. But this profile of a graduate builder is really a neat way for you personally to start reflecting on what you think the 21st century competencies are that you're going to embrace. But it also affords anybody who fills it out the opportunity to share it with others and take your profile of a graduate and show other people in your school or district community what it is, encourage them to go online, encourage them to fill it out. And the idea is that this could create momentum for building a profile of a graduate in your school or in your district. So the other thing the site does is that it provides some wonderful examples of profiles of a graduate from around the country. And I'm going to take you through some of these and for a bunch of reasons, but I want you to see them concretely so that you can see that they're probably the most important thing to show you is that these are not cookie cutter exercises where everybody looks at the 4 C's and just adopts them, or simply, This is really an exercise in each district customizing its own profile of a graduate for its own needs. And before we go to the first slide, let me tell you a story about one of the first times I engaged the community in a conversation around this. A superintendent called me from Springfield, Missouri, and said, Ken, we want you to come to the district. We're going to have 400 parents here, and we want you to engage them in a conversation about, at the time we were calling it the 4 C's, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And he said to me, you know, before you get here, I just want to let you know we only talk about 3 of the C's in our community. And I said to him, well, are you going to tell me which one, or am I going to wait until I get there and stumble into it? And he said, no, in our community, we don't talk much about creativity because it's considered progressive and the conservatives don't like it. So we build creativity into critical thinking and communication and collaboration. And then he said to me, while you're at it, please don't bring up global citizenship. And I said, well, tell me about that. And he goes, in our community, if you're focused on global interests, you are putting the interests of the globe ahead of the interests of the country. And I said, okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. So I wanted to tell you that story, and now let's turn to the first profile of a graduate. This one is from Fairfax County, Virginia. And this is an example. You'll see that they not only have 5 overall competencies that they've created, but they've also created on the next page, they've created a detail that was very important to them to give guidance to teachers on what each of these meant and what's included in each. But I wanted to tell you the first story because I wanted you to see, look at these 5 headings. The middle column in the first draft was citizen, and the right column was self-reliant. And at the end of the first day of community engagement, I asked all the stakeholders, this was a group of 80 to 85 people, would they go back to their community groups that they represented and find out if there's any discomfort with what we've done. Well, as I got into the room for the second meeting a month later, 2 groups were waiting for me. One group said, we don't like the term citizen. And I said, please tell me about that. And they said, well, we have 204 languages spoken in our district. We have lots of immigrants, and we're afraid when people see the term citizen, they're going to interpret it literally, and they won't think that it applies to them. And I said, well, have you given thought to what you would like this term to be? And they said, could we use the term global citizen? And I said, sure, just don't move to Springfield, Missouri. The second group that was waiting for me was on the right column and said, we're very uncomfortable with the term self-reliant. And I said, well, tell me about that. And they said, well, we represent the special needs kids, and we're not sure that all of our kids are capable of self-reliance. And we don't think that that's necessarily the target that they should shoot for. And I said to them, have you given thought to what term you would like? And they came up with goal-directed and resilient individual. So I offer you these concrete examples for 2 reasons. I want you to see that there's no cookie-cutter way to describe these competencies, and more importantly, there are very special nuances in each community as to what these phrases mean and how they'll apply to people. So words really do matter, and in this context, your community groups are going to look carefully at what words work for them and which don't. So I wanted you to see that. The next slide is from Virginia Beach, Virginia. This is their second iteration. This is their Compass to 2020. They've had a Compass to 2015. And this is a very deeply rooted in the community. When they did Compass to 1515, they had 1,000 stakeholders gather in their community center, or their convention center in Virginia Beach, and they ratified their initial vision. And so there's deep, deep understanding in the community about the importance of this. Now there's a dialogue about, you know, can we implement it and how do we implement it, but there's a very broad consensus that these competencies are important. I should say, now that we've looked at both Virginia Beach and Fairfax, those are two of the districts that actually, we have, I think, 15 Ed Leader 21 districts, a number of whom have done profiles of a graduate. These are two examples here, but they led to the, when Susan described the grassroots nature of what led to the profile of a graduate in Virginia, these were two of the districts that really led to that movement in Virginia. The next example is from Dysart Unified School District. This is Surprise, Arizona. This is a profile of a graduate. They take this very seriously. Again, they had a community group develop this, and they have deeply implemented transformation in their district tied to these outcomes. And some of you may know Gail Plenkert, who's the superintendent, who's this year is the chair of AASA nationally, and this is her district. Some of you will remember earlier I mentioned the 4 C's. This is a district that's taken the 4 C's to its, I guess, its most robust implementation. This is Boone County, Kentucky, and they have 10 C's if you follow around the edge. I'm not sure I recommend 10. That's a lot to take on. But again, this frame has really led to deep transformation in the district and something that they feel very, very powerfully about. I think what's cool about this is that you now have examples here of districts that are doing the profile of a graduate in very different ways. There are clearly some through lines, clearly some overlap, but the idea is that it's a unique implementation for each district. I get asked all the time, are these profiles of a graduate for high school? And this is really important. If you go to the next slide, this is a K through 8 district in Illinois at the Kissick Trip. And again, they have a fun implementation with an acronym SEED. But their point here is that they need to, for their high school, they need to produce 8th grade graduates with some clear competencies. And this is a lovely example of a district that's doing great work. And another district that if you go and visited it, they've completely transformed how they teach and learn to meet this model. So I think I can say for certainty that all the examples I've shown you so far, Fairfax, Virginia Beach, Dysart, Boone, and Aptekissick Trip have gone through very deep implementations and very deep shifts in their practice, not just the adoption of a profile of a graduate. Jefferson County, Colorado, is a district that went through its profile of a graduate. There's some fun things here. This logo that you have here was designed by a student after input from the adult participants in the process. They have a CTE program with design in it, and several of the students from that were engaged at tables in this dialogue and then helped us produce options for visual design. You'll see also in this one, particularly if you go to the next page, this is an example where the community was actually had a little bit of a disagreement about how to treat content mastery versus competencies. And you'll see here that there was enough, there were some people in the group felt, look, the state of Colorado is doing so much on content, we don't need to focus on it. And there were others who felt like they needed to articulate their desire to have the competencies and the content integrated with each other. So that this slide represents a very important local view that content mastery needed to be explicit. And I think that they're not the only district that has done that. The next slide is Mount Vernon This is an independent school in Georgia. I don't know if we have how many independent schools we have on the line with us this afternoon, but I wanted to make sure you could see. We're very fortunate in our group to have 20 independent schools in addition to 165 school districts, and then another dozen or so other members. And this is one of our most active members. And you can see, again, a different take. What I love about this is not only the language of the 6 competencies, but they have this poster in every classroom in their school. And when you walk in, the young kindergarten and first graders know what these icons mean, and they actually can articulate for you their aspiration to embody these competencies. This is another, Catherine Smith School is another K through 8 school, and this is another example of the icons being powerful, but also they have posters and murals embracing all of these. And again, this school is a total PBL school, but it's used these competencies not only to make them transparent to the community and the kids, but also to lead to deep transformation in the pedagogy of the school. The last example I want to share with you is from a district in Ohio that years ago created this black circle of 6 skills that is the 4 C's plus global citizenship and self-direction. And when they were done, the superintendent asked me if I would come and do a keynote about their 6 competencies to kick off the school year. And unbeknownst to me, he took this logo and put it on a 79-cent Target plate. And when my speech was over, he gave me the plate with the logo on it, which I thought, you know, I'd come all the way from Tucson to Columbus, Ohio, and I got a 79-cent Target plate. Well, what I didn't know was that the superintendent had needed inexpensive plates because he had made 400 of them, and the next thing he says is bring out the boxes, and his staff handed out all 400 plates to the staff. And once everybody had one on their lap, he said, for the last 9 months while we've been working with a community advisory group and stakeholder group to create these 6 competencies, a lot of you, particularly teachers, have come up to me and said, is this just one more thing you're adding to my plate? And he said, no, 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 this is the plate. So the challenge for all of us, I think, is have we defined our 21st century plate? What's on it, what's off it? And I think that the examples I've given you of the profiles of a graduate are a good set of examples of schools and districts that have clearly defined what's on their 21st century plate. A couple of other topics that I want to cover before we head to Q&A. Susan, did you want to stop me?
I did. I just wanted to interrupt you for a minute. Pat Fitzsimmons, who's joining us from Vermont, who at the state level and several of the districts and communities are really working towards this student B model, and they have a proficiency-based diploma and are focusing on this broader, more holistic set of outcomes as you outlined in Profile of Graduate. But there's a question on the process. How did these groups arrive at the major categories? What process was used? Can you talk a little bit more about how they got started and what process ended in this?
Sure. So I think, though, if it's okay, I just will go to the next question, which is how do you encourage community involvement in the Profile of a Graduate process? I don't think there's any one way. Some school, if that's okay, you've asked me, you've led me right into the next. So the best answer to the question in thoughtfulness is that if you go to the next slide, in the profileofagraduate.org site, we have an implementation guide, and we took the experiences of about a dozen districts and have reduced them to some suggestions for how to do this. And so if, I'll answer the question, but I want you to know that there's a resource that answers the question, which is how do you go about putting together a community consensus? So that is probably the best piece of advice, although it's not always done this way, is to begin a community advisory group. And I think that many districts, not all, many districts create somewhere between 30 and 80 people into a community advisory group. When I get asked, what's how long does it take? My own preference is that they meet 3 times over 6 months, every couple of months, so that they can really process it. Those districts that try to do this in one meeting will find that people are very unsatisfied about the time that they have for digesting all the material. So we do it usually over 3 meetings, and the process is to allow them all to think about the process. One of the suggestions you'll see in here is we use a 3 questions exercise. What's all the change that you've seen in the last 25 years? What's the profound change in society? What competencies do young people need to address that change? And how intentional and purposeful is our district or school about those competencies? That's often our conversation starter. And then, the members are encouraged to offer suggestions, to come up with an initial starting point, to go back out to the community groups that they represent. Some of them are from PTAs, some of them are from cultural groups, some of them are from youth groups, some of them are from cities and economic development groups. And they're all encouraged to go back and take the first draft and get comments and bring them back. And then, at meeting 2, they often sort of coalesce and get about 70 to 90% of the way there. And in meeting 3, they really come to immediate closure. I do want to say that some districts try to do this with only an internal group. I'm not a big fan of that because I think parents and school board members and business leaders should be incorporated into the process. My own view is that the business community and parents who work in the 21st century workforce are some of the best sources of information about why this is important and what it should look like. So I think that's part of it's very, very important. But I think there are schools that are so oriented towards just having educators make decisions like this that it's done as an internal process. That's just not my preference and not what I would recommend, but it is done that way sometimes. Any other questions, Susan, before we go to some overall observations?
I think you're okay to keep moving, and we'll open it up for Q&A. Thanks.
Yep, I'm just have this 2 more sections. So what overall observations do I have? And this will just summarize what I've already covered. There isn't a cookie cutter for 21st century competencies. This is not a one-size-fits-all. Give me the 5 competencies and I'll adopt them. This is a process to get them customized. There also isn't a cookie cutter for community engagement. You can see the Virginia Beach Convention Center on the left side. That's not their usual model. More is what you see on the right here, which is community groups that are grappling with this process together. But somewhere in that range, from a community group on the one hand to 1,000 citizens on the other. I will say that what I have found is that parents and community members love to come together on this topic. This is something that's inspiring to them. And, given all the conversations Susan and I know over the years that in education that are fractious and lead to dissension, this is a topic in which there's usually 80 to 90% agreement. And people can really come together around. I think I've shown you the use of visual imaging is powerful, and I really recommend it. And then maybe the most important overall observation is if this only leads to a profile of a graduate and doesn't lead to deep implementation, then it's a nullity, and all you have is a poster. So I want to go to the last section, which is to say, what's the impact that this can have? How do you know that you've really done something meaningful and powerful? So I use the North Star recommendation because I've seen districts that have asked the question of me always, is this a new initiative? And is this some new initiative I'm adding? And I always say, no, it's not. And I think that the way I think about it is that this is really a direction for all the initiatives of your district. So if you think about personalization, if you think about competency ed, if you think about one-to-one, if you think about portfolios, if you think about capstones, we could go on and on. These competencies will anchor all of those activities. So you're not taking on a new initiative, you're taking on a direction for all your pre-existing initiatives, and I think that that's very important. What we have found in working with the 4 Cs is that we started thinking that the 4 Cs were about just student competencies, but what we have found, and by the 4 Cs I mean whatever your profile of a graduate is, whatever your student B is. The student Bs are student competencies, but they also describe the elements of good pedagogy, the elements of your district or school culture, the elements of leadership in describing that your administrators and the adults in the system need to model these competencies. And then finally, often, they are used to create policies like HR policy. If you're going to adopt a profile of a graduate, your HR policy needs to embrace these competencies so that you're hiring and incentivizing and compensating for the 21st century competencies that matter. What we have found in our work is that these have led to very specific requests by our members to create better definitions of each of these competencies. So we have developed within EdLeader 21, we spent 2 years in 80 districts creating rubrics around critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication so that the posters and the competencies in them have real definition and have the potential to be assessed. After we did that, our superintendent said, well, the rubrics are great, but we also need performance tasks so that teachers know how to actually teach and assess these competencies. And so we've been working on that as well. So I just give you those as a couple of very concrete examples of the implications that having a profile of a graduate can have for your district. So in conclusion, I want to go back to where I started, which is the student A versus student B. This is a journey to me that is one of the most fundamental transformation journeys that districts can be on. And I think the point of this webinar, to my way of thinking, is that your school or district should strongly consider adopting its own version of student B, and that once you do, it has tremendous implications for how you will implement transformation in your district. So I hope, Susan, that's a good overview of the work and provides the participants with some good concrete tools and resources that they can use after today to pursue this work.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I'd like to open it up for questions. We've had a great conversation happening throughout the webinar to Ken in the chat room. I think there was certainly resonance around this being the center point of the North Star. Certainly the idea of designing around exactly what students need to know and be able to do is crucial. I think one thing that I've seen across the U.S. is in doing this work, what you pointed to in your last few slides around the rubrics and then developing these performance assessments is where the implementation, where the rubber really hits the road. Can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of what you have seen in terms of examples of districts once they set their profile of a graduate, then, you know, the question that I've seen across the U.S. is, well, how do we assess that? In this mindset that we've had for so many decades of sort of a right way and a wrong way, what I've seen around the globe is setting up these rubrics, getting educator support to develop the rubrics, to get calibration around the rubrics, and then to understand what it means to assess evidence. And isn't this the heart and soul of our education system, to truly build that educator professional judgment to assess a wide range of knowledge and skills that are critical? So I'd love to hear your thought a little bit more on those rubrics and the performance assessment pieces.
Great. So what I would say is, you know, the rubrics have really been important. Probably no area more than creativity where I find that people have an intention to instill creativity, but if you don't have a working definition of it that includes what are the progressions and what are the components of creativity and what are the progressions that students should exhibit in those components, there's no real ability to move your creativity in the school or district. So to be concrete about it, when I show people the creativity rubric, one of the most interesting things is people will go, well, I would rate our students right now at level 2 of creativity. And then I will say to them, are they capable of level 4? And they go, absolutely. I say, well, what is that about, that they're demonstrating level 2, but they're capable of level 4? And they'll say, well, we just don't have, we're not giving them the opportunity to demonstrate level 4. So the value of the rubrics is to open people's mind, particularly educators' mind, to what is level 4 creativity, so you know the difference between level 1 and level 2 and level 4, because you can't create a classroom environment for level 4 if you haven't articulated what it is. So I find in our work that districts are having their minds opened about level 4 of critical thinking, of collaboration, of communication, of creativity, and that creates the momentum. With regard to the performance tasks, I'll just give you an example because I hear the same question you get all the time, and we actually have created among 35 districts the last 3 years, we've done common creation of a performance task so that people could actually use it, see it graded. We've done that with Jay McTighe, and we've created an IT platform and training to create consistent implementation of the rubric. But to give you a concrete example, this was a student I ran into who had just taken this performance task, and I said, tell me what it was, and he said, well, it was a 5th grade science and English assignment in which we read 4 articles about earthquakes. But this particular assignment was to assess solution finding and problem solving. So they asked us to write a letter to a city in Bangladesh explaining what could be done to ameliorate the impact of the next earthquake. So I read all this stuff, and I realized that one of the biggest problems are shards of glass. So I recommended to the city, to the parents, that they move beds and sofas away from windows so that the kids in particular were away from shards of glass. And then I realized that that wasn't good enough, so I recommended to the city that they change the building code to use glass that didn't shatter as badly. And then he turns to me and he goes, isn't it interesting, you have to solve a problem at both the house level and at the city level. This is a 5th grader. So and the reason I love giving that example is I hear all the time, we don't have enough time, we can't embed this into pre-existing work. Well, this is a standard science and English assignment, and all we did was we layered in a little example of solution finding and problem solving so that the reading's the same, the assignment and the content is the same, but now they're trying to solve a problem. And so they get graded not just on the quality of the letter and the quality of recall, but the quality of problem solving and solution finding. And that's easy to layer in, and it's not a huge extra investment of time. So those gives you examples of the kind of pedagogical shifts that need to happen if you're going to give preference or give emphasis to a topic, for example, like problem solving or solution finding. I hope those are good concrete examples of what you were asking about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ken. That was a great answer. Just pointing to those examples shows that the changes really do become structural, and it's really how you do the work, and it's not like the time is different, but the structure of what you're trying to accomplish and the way and how students and educators do the work and engage in that together becomes different. And I think that that's exciting, and it's also inspiring, and at the heart for why all of us are really committed to these important changes for our students, our educators, and our system. There's another question from Jennifer, which I think is really crucial. She asks, how are these competencies tracked over time and communicated?
Yes, it is a great question, and our districts are slowly but surely working on that, and it comes in so many different flavors. It's hard to give you a monolithic response, but one good example is in Catalina Foothills, outside of Tucson, where I'm from. They have actually changed their report cards, and I think the way they've done it helps understand, a thoughtful way of making this shift. So each department at each grade level gets to choose. I think they have now 7 competencies, and one of the things that people misunderstand is that you have to assess all 7 competencies every time, which is silly. So what they've done is that the departments as a whole choose for every course, every semester, what are the 2 competencies we're going to add. So the report card will give standard feedback on how are you doing on geometry or how are you doing on algebra, but they choose that, for example, with regard to geometry, they are going to be also assessing critical thinking, problem solving, and communication. But with regard to algebra, they're going to be assessing creativity and collaboration. So what you'll find is their theory is over the 12 years, you will have touched all 7 of the skills, but not every semester. And so it allows this thing to breathe, and it allows departments and teachers to say, what's the best match between. So for example, in districts that are emphasizing global competence, they're not going to put global competence into every subject. They don't match well with every subject. But in some subjects, particularly English, particularly foreign languages, global competence may make a lot of sense. Certainly in the sciences they can, but it's not every course that has to have global competence. So I think this vision of mixing and matching the competencies to the courses that make the most sense is a helpful way of thinking about how folks are doing this work. But I like the report card. It's not the only way to do this, but I like the report card because it brings transparency and visibility to these skills in a way that everybody gets to know that, yes, we're judging content, yes, we're teaching the competencies inside content, but we're also making these competencies visible to both students and parents.
I agree, and it also gets to some of the other questions that have been asked throughout, which is college admissions officers are pretty open to this. We're seeing that across the U.S. because they actually have a much better picture of what students know and can be able to do. I think that we have time for one more question. We're getting to the top of the hour. From Laura, she asked, how are the districts balancing the profile of the graduate competencies via teaching and learning and the content required for transcripts? Are you seeing the profile of a graduate ultimately replace the traditional subject areas yet? Ken?
No, I don't think that's the goal. I mean, you know, we've had one district over the life of our 6.5 years that actually taught a class in 21st century competencies. So most of our districts don't see this as, we're still seeing for the moment the competencies being taught in the context of content. I do see a trend, and Susan, I suspect you've seen more and more of this too. The future of high school, the future of K through 12 in my mind is going to revolve more and more on problem solving, local problem solving, national problem solving, global problem solving. And so in that context, we may over time see more interdisciplinary approaches to courses where you're thinking about big problems and teachers are actually working with students to solve major problems. But for the moment, I'm not seeing a replacement. I'm seeing increased visibility in the competencies. And I think it's important, this might be a good note to end the conversation. You started the conversation thinking about policy, and what I think is most of the districts that are doing this work right now, that you've given us two good examples that are the outliers, but most districts are doing this work in spite of policy, not because of it. And what we see is 5 to 15 districts per state that are beginning to do this work because they know it's important, and the hope is that they'll be able to convince their states to make these competencies more visible. So I see us at the beginning of that conversation, and I don't think that the goal is to replace content. I think the goal is to merge content and skills together, whether it be in the context of a subject matter or in the context of problem-solving work. I think there'll be more of the latter over time, and we're just at the beginning of seeing that trend emerge, I think.
Thank you, Ken. I totally agree with you. And we are a local control country, and every state has local control. So literally, communities can do it, districts can do it. You can take this on and drive this future direction. So thanks to all of you that participated today. Thank you for the great conversation in the chat room. Ken, my heartfelt thanks to you in leading this work around the country, and for all the work that you've done in the 4 Cs with the Partnership for 21st Century Skills in your previous role, and for now taking this on with Ed Leader 21 and helping to change the conversation and move us in a place so we can ensure every student's success for this rapidly changing world that we live in towards the higher goals. So thanks to all,
Susan,
and thank you so much.
Susan, I hope you'll go to the last slide and put in a shameless plug for our session at your conference in late October. We'll do a 3-hour version of this, and those people on the call that are interested, I hope you'll come and I hope you'll join us. And I really appreciate Susan's leadership and INACOL's leadership and invitation to raise the visibility of this work. We're very grateful, Susan, to you and to INACOL for taking this on and being so supportive. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and we're thrilled to have you in Orlando in October 23rd. Thank you for leading this hands-on workshop during our pre-conference to focus on profile of a graduate for district leaders. So Ken will be there with Valerie Greenhill from Ed Leader 21, and feel free, if you're on the webinar, to let us know if you have any questions, or you can register for the pre-conference. Well, thanks everyone, and take care, and have a great rest of your week.